The story of Joey Merlino cannot simply begin with his birth, for that would be to ignore the immense gravitational pull of the world he was born into, a world that was less a place on a map and more a state of being, an inheritance of attitude and obligation. South Philadelphia in the early 1960s was a universe unto itself, a tight-knit, working-class enclave where the scent of simmering tomato sauce mingled with the pervasive, unspoken understanding of who really held the keys to the neighborhood. It was a place of proud, hard-working families, of generations of immigrants who had carved out their piece of the American dream with calloused hands and relentless determination. But woven directly into the fabric of this vibrant, noisy, passionate community was another, quieter, more powerful network, one built on silence and loyalty, on fear and favor, a world where a handshake could mean more than a contract and a sideways glance could carry the weight of a death sentence. This was the Philadelphia crime family, a robust and notoriously violent branch of the American Mafia, La Cosa Nostra, and it was into this dual reality that Joseph Salvatore Merlino Jr. entered the world on March 13, 1962. His father, Salvatore Chucky Merlino, was not a minor player on this shadowy stage. He was a formidable, high-ranking capo, a man of significant stature and respect within the organization, a man who moved through the streets of South Philly with the quiet authority of someone who knew he was protected by a power greater than any municipal law. From his very first breath, Joey Merlino's life was preordained, his path illuminated not by the streetlights of his neighborhood but by the dark, glittering allure of his father's world. He didn't learn about this life from storybooks or television. He absorbed it through the very air he breathed, through the whispered conversations that stopped when he entered a room, through the palpable deference shown to his father by shopkeepers and grown men alike. The Merlino household, while a family home, was also a de facto headquarters, a place where business was conducted behind closed doors, where the language of power and criminal enterprise was a native tongue. Young Joey watched the men who came to see his father, their expensive suits, their heavy gold jewelry, their casual confidence that bordered on arrogance. He saw the easy money that changed hands, the palpable respect his father commanded without ever having to raise his voice. For a boy growing up in this environment, the legitimate world, the world of 9-to-5 jobs, of answering to a boss, of struggling to pay bills, seemed not just dull, but utterly illogical. Why would anyone choose that life when this other, more thrilling and rewarding existence was right there, waiting for him? The classroom held no interest for him. Its lessons in history and mathematics were abstractions compared to the concrete, street-level education he was receiving daily. His school was the corner of Passyunk and Tasker. His teachers were the wise guys who loitered outside the social clubs and cafes. And his curriculum was the intricate web of alliances, rivalries, and unspoken rules that governed the Philadelphia underworld. He learned the art of the hustle not from a textbook, but from watching his father's crew operate their numbers games, their loan sharking, their control over the unions. He learned about power not through political theory, but by witnessing the fear that his father's name could instill. He was a prince of this gritty kingdom, and everyone, from his peers to the old-timers in the organization, knew it. They called him Skinny Joey because of his lanky frame, but the nickname belied a fierce ambition that was already burning within him. He wasn't content to simply be Chucky Merlino's son. He wanted to be a legend in his own right, to eclipse even his father's considerable reputation. He assembled his own crew of young, ambitious neighborhood kids, a group that would later be dubbed the Young Executioners, a name that perfectly captured their lethal intent and their hunger for notoriety. They started small, with petty crimes and strong-arm robberies, but their sights were set on the big time. For Joey, this was more than just making money. It was a rite of passage, a way to prove his mettle, to demonstrate to the old guard that he had the nerve, the cunning, and the ruthlessness required to not just join their ranks, but to one day lead them. The stage was being set, the characters were in place, and the trajectory of Joey Merlino's life was arcing sharply upward, fueled by a sense of entitlement and a burning desire to claim the crown he believed was his birthright. The calm before the storm was ending, and the winds of a violent generational shift were beginning to stir in the narrow streets of South Philadelphia. The ascent of a young prince in a world built on sand and violence is never a smooth one, and for Joey Merlino, the first true test of his mettle came not from a rival gangster or an ambitious federal agent, but from the very institution that was meant to be his foundation. The traditional mafia, for all its talk of honor and omerta, was a fractious and paranoid organism, constantly threatened by internal schisms and the relentless pressure of law enforcement. The Philadelphia family, under the leadership of the old-school boss Angelo Bruno, had enjoyed a period of relative stability, an era often referred to as the Quiet Don years, where business was conducted with a minimum of public bloodshed. But this fragile peace was shattered on a March evening in 1980, when Bruno was brutally assassinated, shot in the head while sitting in his car after a long day, a hit that was sanctioned by his own underboss, Antonio Caponigro, and, many believe, with the tacit approval of the powerful Genovese crime family in New York. This single act of treachery flung the Philadelphia mob into a chaotic and bloody period of internal war, a storm of paranoia and retribution that would define a generation. For the young Merlino, this was a masterclass in the ultimate price of power. He saw the precarious nature of a boss's life, how quickly loyalty could curdle into murderous ambition. The subsequent reign of Phil Tester, known as the Chicken Man, was brutally short-lived. He was killed just a year later by a nail bomb rigged to his front porch, an explosion so powerful it was heard for blocks and left a crater on his doorstep. This was the world Joey was now actively entering, a world where your own home was no longer a sanctuary. Into this power vacuum stepped a new, formidable figure. Nicodemo Little Nicky Scarfo, a man whose diminutive stature was utterly contradicted by his volcanic temper and his pathological appetite for violence. Scarfo, who had been living in Atlantic City, was a true believer in the old, savage ways of Cosa Nostra, and he embarked on a reign of terror designed to purge the family of any perceived disloyalty. His rise, however, created a direct and personal problem for the Merlino family. Chucky Merlino, Joey's father, was a staunch ally of the previous regime and was viewed by the increasingly paranoid Scarfo as a potential rival, a man with too much independent power and his own loyal faction. The tension was thick and poisonous. Joey, now in his early 20s, was no longer just an observer. He was a soldier in his father's crew, a young man with everything to prove, operating in an environment where a single wrong word or a misplaced glance could be a death sentence. He watched as Scarfo's henchmen, men like Salvatore Chucky Merlino's own nephew, Philip Crazy Phil Leonetti, carried out a series of brutal, almost ritualistic murders, eliminating anyone Scarfo deemed a threat. The message was clear: absolute loyalty to Scarfo was the only currency that mattered, and the Merlino name was now a liability. This period was a crucible that forged Joey's future approach to leadership. He saw firsthand how Scarfo's unchecked brutality, while initially effective at instilling fear, also sowed the seeds of its own destruction, creating a family riddled with informants who were more terrified of their own boss than they were of the FBI. It was during these turbulent years that Joey's own legend began to grow on the streets. He wasn't just a boss's son, he was proving himself to be cunning, fearless, and fiercely loyal to his own small circle, which included his childhood friend and future partner in crime, Michael Mikey Chang Sign Cagligna. They built their own reputation through a series of bold armed robberies, shaking down drug dealers, and running lucrative gambling operations, all while navigating the deadly political minefield of Scarfo's Philadelphia. They were young, brash, and flush with cash, driving expensive cars and flaunting their success in a way that deliberately contrasted with the older, more discreet generation. This was a new kind of mobster in the making, one who understood the power of image and reputation as much as the power of a gun. But the shadow of Scarfo's purges was growing longer, and the threat to his father, and by extension to Joey himself, was becoming intolerable. The pressure was building towards an inevitable explosion, a confrontation that would force Joey Merlino to make a choice between survival and submission, a choice that would define the rest of his life and set him on a collision course with the very heart of the mafia's power structure. The young prince was about to be tested in the fire, and the outcome would determine whether he would be consumed by the flames or emerge tempered into a king. The inevitable clash between the old guard's paranoia and the new generation's ambition finally erupted with the force of a long-smoldering volcano, irrevocably altering the landscape of Joey Merlino's life and setting him on the path of a fugitive. The breaking point came in the mid-1980s, as Nicodemo Scarfo's blood-soaked reign reached its peak of insanity, his hit list growing to include not just perceived rivals but increasingly, his own loyalists, consumed by a bottomless pit of suspicion. Chucky Merlino, a man of significant influence and independent wealth, represented a clear and present danger to Scarfo's absolute authority, a power center that could not be tolerated. The order was given: Chucky Merlino had to be eliminated. For Joey, this was no longer a business dispute. It was a deeply personal, existential threat to his family and his very name. The abstract lessons of mob life suddenly became terrifyingly concrete. The knowledge that a contract was out on his father's life transformed the streets of South Philadelphia from a familiar playground into a labyrinth of potential ambushes, where every parked car might hold assassins and every friendly face could be a mask for betrayal. This was the ultimate test of his loyalty and his nerve, forcing him and his crew, the young executioners, into a state of high alert, acting as a protective detail for his father while simultaneously trying to maintain their own criminal enterprises under the oppressive weight of Scarfo's tyranny. The situation was untenable, a pressure cooker with no release valve. The only logical move, the only path to survival, was a desperate and audacious one. They had to strike first. In 1987, a plan was hatched, a bold attempt to decapitate the Scarfo regime in one fell swoop by assassinating Nicodemo Scarfo himself. The plot was a testament to the sheer desperation and raw courage of the Merlino faction. They tracked Scarfo's movements, looking for an opening, a moment of vulnerability. That moment presented itself one evening as Scarfo and his inner circle, including his nephew and primary enforcer, Philip Leonetti, were dining at a popular Italian restaurant, Dante's and Luigi's. The plan was set into motion. A team of hitters was positioned, waiting for the perfect shot. But the world of organized crime is one of constant, swirling paranoia, and secrets are a fragile currency. Whether through a leak, a betrayal, or simply the heightened security around a boss who had ordered dozens of murders, the plot was discovered. The result was catastrophic for the Merlino faction. Instead of eliminating Scarfo, they had signed their own death warrants. The retaliation was swift and merciless. Chucky Merlino was arrested on racketeering charges, a move seen by many as a deliberate attempt to place him in a vulnerable position, and soon after, he was convicted and sentenced to a lengthy prison term, effectively neutralizing him. But for Joey, the consequences were even more dire. With his father imprisoned and the full fury of the Scarfo family now focused directly on him, he became a primary target. A formal contract for his murder was issued, a death sentence from which there was seemingly no appeal. Overnight, Joey Merlino, the brash young prince of South Philadelphia, was forced to disappear. He went on the run, becoming a ghost in the very neighborhood he had once ruled with such visible swagger. This period of his life was a stark lesson in survival, stripping away all the glamour and reducing existence to its most primal elements: trust, suspicion, and the constant, gnawing fear of a violent end. He lived out of cars, in safe houses that felt anything but safe, constantly looking over his shoulder. His world shrunk down to a few trusted associates and the ever-present weight of the gun on his hip. The flashy clothes and expensive jewelry were replaced by anonymity. The public bravado was replaced by the silent, watchful intensity of a hunted animal. This was a formative crucible that would forever shape his character. It taught him the absolute value of a small, loyal crew over a large, unwieldy organization. It honed his instincts for danger to a razor's edge. And it instilled in him a profound understanding that in his world, there was no permanent safety, only temporary reprieves. He was learning the art of war not from a position of strength, but from the desperate, gritty reality of being the underdog, a perspective that would later define his entire approach to leadership. While he was in hiding, the world above him continued to turn. The very brutality that had forced him underground was also, ironically, creating the conditions for his eventual return. Scarfo's reign of terror was producing a bumper crop of informants. Men who had seen their friends and relatives murdered on mere suspicion were now, faced with long prison sentences, choosing to break their oath of omerta and cooperate with the FBI. The house that Scarfo built was beginning to crumble under the weight of its own savagery, and the federal government was ready with the wrecking ball. The stage was being set for a dramatic power shift, and though he was deep in the shadows, waiting and watching, Joey Merlino's exile was about to end. The hunted was poised to become the hunter. The downfall of Nicodemo Scarfo arrived not with the dramatic flair of a mob shootout, but with the cold, procedural efficiency of the American judicial system, a force far more relentless and impervious to intimidation than any rival crime family. While Joey Merlino navigated the treacherous shadows of his underground existence, the foundations of Scarfo's empire were being systematically dismantled by the very men he had once commanded. The turning point was the cooperation of his own nephew and underboss, Philip Leonetti, who, after being convicted on racketeering charges and facing the prospect of dying in prison, made the momentous decision to break the sacred code of silence and become a government witness. Leonetti's defection was catastrophic for Scarfo. He was not just a high-ranking member, he was the family's principal executioner, a man who had personally carried out or been present for nearly 24 murders ordered by his uncle. His testimony was a historical record of the bloodshed, providing federal prosecutors with an intimate, first-hand account of the inner workings of the Philadelphia Mafia's most violent era. The floodgates were now open. Other high-ranking members, facing equally daunting prison sentences, saw the writing on the wall and followed Leonetti's path, trading their loyalty for a chance at freedom through the Federal Witness Protection Program. The subsequent trial was a media sensation, a detailed public autopsy of a criminal organization devouring itself from within. Scarfo, along with many of his top aides, was convicted on a sweeping racketeering indictment and sentenced to multiple life sentences, effectively ending his reign and consigning him to a concrete tomb for the remainder of his days. This seismic shift in the power structure created a vacuum, a vast, unclaimed territory that was ripe for the taking. For Joey Merlino, emerging cautiously from his forced exile, the landscape of Philadelphia was transformed. The man who had ordered his death was now permanently neutralized, and the old guard that had supported that regime was either in prison, dead, or had been turned into informants. The path to power, once blocked by a wall of ruthless opposition, was now startlingly clear. He returned to the streets of South Philadelphia not as a fugitive, but as a claimant to a vacant throne, a young lion who had, by sheer force of survival, outlasted his most powerful predator. He was now in his late 20s, and the years on the run had sanded away some of his youthful brashness, replacing it with a more calculated, strategic cunning. He understood that the old model of Scarfo's rule, a top-down dictatorship built on fear and frequent murder, was a flawed and ultimately self-destructive system. He had witnessed how it created a culture of betrayal. His vision for the family was different. It would be a partnership, a more corporate structure where power was shared with his most trusted allies from the young executioners, men like Michael Mikey Chang Scincaglia and Joseph Skinny Joey Scincaglia, who had stood by him during the darkest days of the Scarfo War. Together, they began to consolidate control, picking up the pieces of the family's various criminal rackets, the illegal gambling operations, the loan sharking, the labor union infiltration, and reinvigorating them with a new energy. But another, more formidable contender also saw the opportunity in Scarfo's downfall. John Stanfa, a Sicilian-born old-school mafioso who had been a loyal driver for the former boss Angelo Bruno and had managed to remain largely unscathed during the Scarfo years, earning a reputation as a steady, if unspectacular, soldier. Stanfa was backed by the powerful Gambino crime family in New York, who viewed the chaotic Philadelphia family as a lucrative satellite that needed a firm, traditional hand to guide it. The stage was now set for a conflict that would be even more brutal and personal than the one with Scarfo. It was a classic dichotomy. Merlino represented the new generation, American-born, flashy, media-savvy, and entrepreneurial, while Stanfa embodied the old world, Sicilian, secretive, rigid, and deeply traditional. The Philadelphia family was about to be torn in two, and the streets that had just begun to recover from one war were about to be drenched in blood once again. A conflict that would test every lesson Joey Merlino had learned about survival, loyalty, and the brutal cost of power. He was no longer the hunted prince. He was a king in waiting, and he would let no one, not even a New York-backed traditionalist, stand in the way of what he believed was his birthright. The war that erupted between Joey Merlino's fledgling faction and the John Stanfa-led Old Guard was not a single battle but a protracted, bloody, and deeply personal guerrilla conflict that turned the streets of Philadelphia into an urban battlefield, a conflict defined by its shocking brutality, its psychological warfare, and its profound stakes for the very soul of organized crime in the city. This was not a dispute over a single racket or a minor point of disrespect. It was a fundamental ideological schism over who had the legitimate right to lead and what the future of the Philadelphia crime family should look like. Stanfa, with his direct backing from the Gambino family, believed he was restoring order and tradition, imposing a strict, hierarchical Sicilian model onto what he saw as a band of undisciplined, reckless American kids. Merlino and his young executioners saw themselves as the rightful heirs, the ones who had suffered under Scarfo and who represented the new blood necessary to drag the family into the modern era. The opening salvo of this war was as audacious as it was symbolic, a clear message that Merlino would not be cowed by tradition or New York's influence. On a summer evening in 1993, as John Stanfa was driving on the Schuylkill Expressway with his young son, a car pulled alongside and gunmen opened fire with a ferocious hail of bullets. Stanfa, displaying a survivor's instincts, ducked and swerved, saving his own life and that of his child, but he was shot in the face and ear, a wound that would leave him permanently disfigured. The attempt was a declaration of all-out war, and it demonstrated Merlino's willingness to strike directly at the king, regardless of the collateral damage or the consequences. Stanfa's response was predictably savage and immediate. The conflict descended into a cycle of tit-for-tat assassinations and attempted hits that played out like a grim, real-life thriller. Stanfa's crew, relying on their old-world connections and methods, began systematically targeting Merlino's inner circle. The violence was relentless and terrifyingly public. One of Merlino's closest friends and key allies, Joseph Joey Chang Saincaglinia, was ambushed and shot, though he miraculously survived. The war was fought with car bombs, a favorite tactic of the old Sicilian Mafia, and drive-by shootings in broad daylight that terrorized neighborhoods and brought an unprecedented level of law enforcement scrutiny onto both factions. Merlino, having learned from his years on the run, proved to be an elusive and cunning target. He operated like a ghost, constantly changing his routines, using decoy vehicles, and trusting only a handful of individuals with his whereabouts. His crew, younger and more agile, adopted hit-and-run tactics, using their intimate knowledge of the South Philly streets to their advantage. The psychological dimension of the war was just as critical as the physical one. Merlino understood the power of perception. While Stanfa operated from the shadows, Merlino began to cultivate a public persona. He was seen in popular restaurants, dressed in sharp, expensive suits, projecting an image of confidence and invincibility. This was a deliberate strategy. It was a message to the underworld that he was not hiding, that he was unfazed by Stanfa's attempts on his life, and that he was the true, charismatic leader of the new generation. This brazen public display was a double-edged sword, however. While it bolstered his legend on the street, it also made him a brightly lit target for both Stanfa's hitmen and the FBI, who were meticulously building cases against both sides, watching the violence unfold and gathering evidence from wiretaps, surveillance, and the inevitable informants that such a brutal war creates. The pressure was immense and unrelenting, a constant state of hypervigilance where every moment of normalcy was a fleeting illusion. The war reached a pivotal and tragic crescendo in the summer of 1993, a moment that would sear itself into the memory of the city and personally haunt Joey Merlino for the rest of his life. In a devastating twist of fate and mistaken identity, Merlino's best friend and most trusted lieutenant, Mikey Chang Saincaglinia, was gunned down and killed by Stanfa's crew outside a social club. The gunman had been lying in wait for Merlino himself, and when they saw a similar car and a man of a similar build, they opened fire, cutting down the wrong man. The death of Mikey Chang was a profound personal loss for Merlino, a blow that transcended the criminal calculus of the war. This was his childhood friend, his partner, his brother in arms. The grief and rage from this event galvanized Merlino's faction, hardening their resolve to eradicate Stanfa at any cost. The war was no longer just about power. It was now a blood feud, a quest for vengeance that would only end with the complete annihilation of one side or the other. The streets of Philadelphia were trembling under the weight of this conflict, and the body count was rising, drawing the unwavering gaze of a federal government that was now determined to end the violence by putting both kings and all their pawns behind bars forever. The brutal, chaotic war between Merlino and Stanfa, while devastating in its human cost, could not persist in the bright, unforgiving spotlight it had created for itself. The sheer volume of violence and the very public nature of their conflict had drawn the focused, relentless attention of the federal government, which now moved with decisive force to dismantle both factions in one sweeping, surgical strike. The FBI, which had been monitoring the war through wiretaps, electronic surveillance, and a growing roster of terrified informants, had amassed an overwhelming amount of evidence against both leaders and their top lieutenants. The streets, still echoing with the gunfire that had killed Mikey Chang Saincaglinia, were about to fall silent under the weight of the law. The end began for John Stanfa first. In 1994, a massive federal indictment was unsealed, charging Stanfa and 23 of his associates with a litany of crimes, including racketeering, murder, attempted murder, and extortion. The evidence against Stanfa was devastating, much of it coming from his own mouth, captured on secret FBI recordings made inside his car and his social clubs. On these tapes, Stanfa could be heard discussing murders, orchestrating hits, and solidifying his alliance with the Gambino family, providing prosecutors with a verbatim account of his reign. His trial was a foregone conclusion. He was convicted on all counts and sentenced to multiple life sentences in prison, a fate that mirrored that of his predecessor, Nicodemo Scarfo. With Stanfa permanently removed from the chessboard, the path was finally clear for Joey Merlino to assume the mantle of boss, but his victory was Pyrrhic and came with the certain knowledge that the full force of the federal justice system was now turning its gaze directly onto him. He had won the war, but he was now the undisputed king of a kingdom under siege. The Merlino era officially began, but it was an era defined from its very first moment by the specter of impending prosecution. Merlino, now in his early 30s, moved quickly to consolidate his power, restructuring the fractured Philadelphia crime family with himself at the head and his most loyal surviving allies, like Joseph Uncle Joe Ligambi, in key positions of authority. He understood that the old methods were unsustainable. The Scarfo and Stanfa years had proven that excessive public murder was a recipe for long prison sentences and a family riddled with informants. His approach was more nuanced, more corporate. He focused on the money-making ventures that drew less heat. Illegal sports betting operations that spanned the country, sophisticated loan sharking rings that preyed on small business owners and gamblers, and the systematic extortion of nightclubs, bars, and construction sites. He was a boss for a new age, one who preferred to make money rather than headlines with bodies. He cultivated an image of the Teflon Don, a charismatic, flashy figure who was beloved in his South Philadelphia neighborhood, known for his lavish Christmas displays, his generosity to local charities, and his ubiquitous presence at the best restaurants and nightclubs. He drove a Bentley, wore custom-made suits, and seemed to float above the fray, untouchable and immune to the law. This public persona was a powerful tool. It built a wall of local support and created an aura of invincibility that was both a deterrent to potential rivals and a point of pride for his crew. But beneath the surface glamour, the machinery of the law was grinding away inexorably. The FBI had not forgotten about Joey Merlino. They had simply been building a better, more comprehensive case. They planted bugs in his social clubs and in the cars of his associates. They tracked his every move, photographed his meetings, and analyzed his financial transactions. They patiently gathered the threads of his criminal empire, waiting to weave them into an inescapable net. Merlino, for his part, was keenly aware of the surveillance. He became a master of evasion, speaking in code, avoiding direct discussions of crimes, and using intermediaries to insulate himself. It was a high-stakes game of cat and mouse, with Merlino believing his charm, his street smarts, and his carefully constructed layers of insulation would be enough to keep him free. For years, it seemed to work. He was arrested, charged with minor offenses, but the big, career-ending racketeering case always seemed to elude prosecutors. This period of successful evasion only bolstered his legend, reinforcing the Teflon nickname and creating a widespread belief that Joey Merlino was simply too clever, too connected, and too lucky to ever be convicted. But the federal government's patience is vast, and its resources are limitless. The pressure was building, the net was closing, and the seemingly charmed life of Joey Merlino was heading for a reckoning that would test his luck, his leadership, and his legacy to their absolute limits. A confrontation in a courtroom that would determine whether the new model of mob boss could truly survive in an era of advanced electronic surveillance and relentless federal prosecution. The long-anticipated reckoning for Joey Merlino finally materialized not with a dramatic, street-level arrest, but through the cold, methodical machinery of the federal justice system, which, after years of patient evidence gathering, ensnared him in a sweeping racketeering indictment that promised to be the definitive trial of his life and career. The year was 1999, and the case built against Merlino and his top echelon of associates was a masterpiece of modern prosecution, a product of thousands of hours of wiretapped conversations, the testimony of turncoat mobsters, and the intricate work of FBI agents who had pieced together the complex financial web of his criminal enterprise. The specific charges were devastating in their scope: racketeering conspiracy, which served as an umbrella for a host of underlying crimes including illegal gambling, extortion, loan sharking, and most seriously, multiple counts of murder. The murder allegations were the centerpiece of the government's strategy, designed to ensure that a conviction would result in a life sentence without the possibility of parole, permanently removing the charismatic boss from the streets. These were not just any murders, they were the foundational killings from the bloody war with John Stanfa, including the brutal slaying of William Billy Vesey and the attempted hit on Stanfa himself, acts of violence that the prosecution argued were essential to Merlino's rise to power and his consolidation of control over the Philadelphia family. For Merlino, who had always projected an image of a more sophisticated, less violent criminal entrepreneur, these charges struck at the very heart of the legend he had cultivated, portraying him not as a modern gangster but as a ruthless and traditional mob killer. The trial, which began in 2001, was an immediate media circus, dubbed the Junior G Mafia trial by the press, a spectacle that captivated the city and the nation. The courtroom became a stage where the dark history of the Philadelphia mob was laid bare for a jury of ordinary citizens to dissect. The prosecution's case was a relentless parade of evidence, secret recordings filled with veiled threats and coded language, forensic experts detailing ballistics and crime scenes, and perhaps most damningly, the testimony of former friends and allies who had chosen to cooperate with the government to save themselves from decades in prison. These were men who had once broken bread with Merlino, who had stood beside him during the war, and who now, under the bright lights of the courtroom, pointed the finger of blame directly at him, describing in chilling detail the inner workings of his organization and his alleged role in authorizing violence. The defense strategy, led by a skilled and aggressive legal team, was to attack the credibility of these government witnesses, painting them as desperate liars and convicted murderers who were fabricating stories to satisfy prosecutors and reduce their own sentences. They argued that Merlino was a legitimate businessman, a popular neighborhood figure who was being persecuted for his reputation and his flamboyant lifestyle, not for any proven crimes. They meticulously picked apart the wiretap recordings, arguing that the ambiguous, coded language did not prove Merlino's direct involvement in any murders. For weeks, the battle raged in the courtroom, a high-stakes duel where Merlino's freedom, and potentially his life, hung in the balance. He sat at the defense table, impeccably dressed and composed, often projecting an air of detached amusement, as if the entire proceeding were a minor inconvenience. But beneath the calm exterior was a man fighting for his survival, listening as his past was dissected and his future was decided by a group of strangers. The jury deliberations were tense and protracted, stretching on for days, a reflection of the complexity of the case and the gravity of the charges. The public and the press waited with bated breath, wondering if the Teflon Don reputation would hold or if it would finally be shattered by a guilty verdict. When the jury finally returned, the atmosphere in the courtroom was electric with anticipation. The verdict was a stunning, mixed bag that left both sides reeling. On the one hand, Joey Merlino was found guilty of racketeering conspiracy, a serious felony that carried a potential sentence of decades in prison. This was a monumental victory for the government, a definitive declaration that he was the leader of a criminal enterprise. But on the other hand, in a shocking and unexpected twist, the jury acquitted him on all murder counts. This was a catastrophic failure for the prosecution's most ambitious goal and a resounding personal victory for Merlino. He had beaten the most serious charges, the ones that would have guaranteed he died behind bars. The message was clear. While the jury believed he was a mob boss, they did not believe the government had proven, beyond a reasonable doubt, that he was a murderer. The Teflon label, while scuffed, had not entirely peeled away. He had survived the government's best shot, but his fight was far from over. The looming sentencing hearing would now determine the price he would pay for the conviction he did receive, a price that would define the next chapter of his life and his enduring legacy in the annals of American organized crime. The sentencing of Joey Merlino in the wake of his dramatic, partial courtroom victory was a moment of profound and sobering reckoning. A stark reminder that even a mitigated defeat in the federal system carries a price so steep it can consume a man's prime and redefine his entire world. While the acquittals on the murder charges were a personal and legal triumph that undoubtedly saved him from dying in a prison cell, the conviction for racketeering conspiracy remained a formidable and powerful tool in the hands of the judge, who had the discretion to impose a sentence that reflected the sheer scope and pernicious influence of Merlino's criminal empire. The prosecution, stung by the jury's rejection of their most serious allegations, argued vehemently for a maximum possible sentence, portraying Merlino not as a chastened man but as an unrepentant and sophisticated crime lord who had woven a web of corruption and violence through the city of Philadelphia and who, if given any leniency, would simply return to his life of crime at the first opportunity. They presented evidence of the fear he instilled, the businesses he crippled through extortion, and the lives ruined by his loan-sharking operations, painting a picture of a predator who hid behind a facade of neighborhood generosity and flashy charm. The defense, in contrast, pleaded for mercy, highlighting his roles as a father and a son, his charitable acts within the community, and the fact that he had been absolved of the most violent accusations, arguing that a lengthy sentence would be unjust in light of the jury's clear verdict on the murder counts. They presented him as a product of his environment, a man who had chosen a criminal path but who was not the monster the government claimed him to be. In the end, the judge delivered a sentence that sought to balance these competing narratives. 14 years in a federal penitentiary, a term that, while far short of the life sentence the prosecution had initially sought, was nonetheless a devastating blow, a concrete span of years that represented a significant portion of a man's life. For Joey Merlino, who had just entered his 40s, This meant that he would be well into his 50s upon his release, a period of life that should have been the peak of his power and influence instead being spent in a controlled, monotonous, and dangerous environment. His entry into the federal prison system was the beginning of a new kind of war, a war of attrition against boredom, institutional control, and the constant, low-grade threat of violence that permeates every corner of prison life. The charismatic boss who had held court in fine restaurants was now an inmate with a number, his movements dictated by a strict schedule, his interactions monitored, his world shrunk to the confines of a cell block. This period of incarceration was a forced hiatus, a pause button pressed on his reign, and it created a power vacuum within the Philadelphia family that was quickly filled by his trusted underboss, Joseph Uncle Joe Legambi, who took the reins as the acting boss in Merlino's absence. Legambi's leadership style was a deliberate and calculated contrast to the flamboyant Merlino era. He was low-key, discreet, and averse to the kind of high-profile violence that attracted federal attention, focusing instead on maintaining the family's lucrative rackets with a minimum of fuss and a maximum of operational security. For the better part of a decade, the Philadelphia mob operated under this quieter, more stable model, a testament to Legambi's steady hand, but also a period that saw the gradual erosion of Merlino's direct influence over the day-to-day operations of the organization he had fought so hard to build and lead. From his prison cell, Merlino could only watch and wait, his connection to the outside world limited to monitored phone calls and visits, his power becoming more symbolic than actual with each passing year. Yet, even in prison, the legend of Skinny Joey persisted. He carried himself with the same air of confidence. He was respected by inmates and feared by many, and he remained a potent symbol of the old-school mobster, a figure from a more dramatic and violent era in the city's criminal history. He spent his time reading, working out, and navigating the complex social hierarchies of the prison population, all the while planning for the future, for the day when he would walk free and attempt to reclaim his place in a world that had continued to move on without him. The 14-year sentence was a monumental obstacle, but for a survivor like Joey Merlino, it was not the end of his story. It was merely an intermission, a long, forced retreat in a lifelong battle for power, prestige, and survival, a battle that he was not yet ready to concede, setting the stage for one of the most remarkable and unconventional chapters in the entire history of American organized crime. The world that Joey Merlino re-entered upon his release from federal prison in 2011 was a landscape fundamentally altered, a new reality where the old rules of La Cosa Nostra seemed almost quaint in the face of advanced technology, diminished influence, and a generation that no longer revered the mafia's traditional codes of conduct. After 14 years of incarceration, the charismatic boss who had once commanded headlines emerged as a free man into a digital age he scarcely recognized, a world of smartphones, social media, and pervasive surveillance that made the wiretaps of his heyday seem primitive by comparison. South Philadelphia, his lifelong kingdom, had also changed. The old social clubs had shuttered, the neighborhoods had gentrified, and the unwavering street-level loyalty that had once shielded mobsters was now a fading memory, eroded by time and a more diverse, less insular population. The Philadelphia crime family, now under the steady, low-profile management of Joseph Uncle Joe Legambi, had deliberately cooled its operations, avoiding the violent, headline-grabbing conflicts that had defined Merlino's rise and had ultimately landed him in prison. This new, cautious approach had kept the organization intact and out of the crosshairs of a major federal prosecution during his absence, but it had also created a new power dynamic. Merlino was the returning king, a legendary figure from a more glamorous and dangerous era, but the day-to-day control of the family's criminal enterprises, the gambling, the loan sharking, the minor extortions, was firmly in the hands of Legambi and his inner circle. This created an immediate and tense undercurrent of succession politics. Was Merlino simply resuming his role as the official boss, or was he now a symbolic figurehead, a revered relic whose time had passed? The traditional protocol would demand that Legambi immediately cede control back to the paroled boss, but the practical realities of power are rarely so straightforward. Legambi had kept the ship afloat and profitable for over a decade, and his faction was unlikely to simply step aside for a man who had been absent for so long. This inherent tension simmered just beneath the surface, a silent, psychological Cold War fought in social clubs and through intermediaries, a battle for the soul of the family. Merlino, ever the pragmatist and survivor, seemed to understand that a direct, violent power grab would be catastrophic. It would trigger another internal war and instantly draw the focused wrath of the FBI, which was monitoring his every move from the moment he stepped out of prison. Instead of forcefully reclaiming his throne through intimidation, he embarked on a different, more subtle strategy, one that leveraged his most potent remaining asset, his celebrity. He became a master of the new media landscape, a performance of his own legend played out on the public stage. He was frequently photographed at the best steakhouses, he cultivated a popular and widely followed social media presence, and he became a ubiquitous presence in the gossip pages, often pictured with celebrities, living a life of apparent luxury and leisure. This was a brilliant, if risky, tactical move. On one hand, it reinforced his brand and reminded the underworld, and his own organization, that he was still the star, the main attraction, the one with the real power and connections. It was a form of soft power that required no violent orders, just the constant curation of an image of success and invincibility. He was no longer just a mob boss, he was Joey Merlino, the brand, a folk hero to some and a fascinating anachronism to others. On the other hand, this very public lifestyle was a direct challenge to the low-profile ethos that had protected the family during his imprisonment, and it infuriated the law enforcement officials who watched him flaunt his freedom, convinced that his flashy lifestyle was funded by the very criminal empire they were trying to dismantle. Meanwhile, the more traditional Legambi faction continued its operations in the shadows, leading to a strange, bifurcated existence for the Philadelphia family, with a public, media-savvy leader and a private, operational core that may or may not have been fully under his command. This period was a masterclass in adaptation from Merlino, a demonstration that he understood the power of perception in the 21st century. He was navigating a path that no mob boss had ever walked before, trying to lead a traditional criminal organization while living a very public, modern life. But this high-wire act could not last forever. The federal government, frustrated by his public persona and convinced he was still the active head of the family, was already at work in the background, weaving a new net, one built not on the violent murders of the past, but on the sophisticated financial crimes of the present, setting the stage for a final, dramatic legal confrontation that would seek to finally and permanently end the long, resilient career of the last great celebrity mobster. The federal government's relentless pursuit of Joey Merlino culminated in a final, ambitious legal offensive that reflected the evolving nature of organized crime itself, shifting the battlefield from the blood-soaked streets of Philadelphia to the complex, shadowy world of white-collar fraud and multi-state criminal conspiracies. This new case, which emerged in 2016, was not built on the testimony of mob turncoats or evidence of brutal murders, but was instead a product of a sophisticated, long-term undercover operation based in New York, targeting a sprawling network of alleged East Coast crime figures involved in a sophisticated health insurance fraud scheme. The indictment was a stunning document, alleging that Merlino, along with associates from the Genovese and Gambino crime families, had orchestrated a massive plot to defraud health insurance companies by filing millions of dollars in false claims for compounded medications that were never prescribed, never needed, and never actually provided to patients. This was a far cry from the traditional mob rackets of his youth. It was a digital-age crime, exploiting loopholes in the healthcare system and relying on complicit doctors and pharmacists to generate illicit profits. For the prosecution, this case was a strategic masterstroke. It allowed them to charge Merlino under the powerful Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, the same statute used to convict him in 2001, but with a modern twist that they hoped would be more palatable to a jury and less susceptible to the ambiguities of coded language about murder. The evidence was largely financial, a complex paper trail of wire transfers, shell companies, and insurance forms, and it included secretly recorded conversations from the undercover operation. The government's argument was that Merlino, even after his long prison stint, had not reformed. He had simply adapted, leveraging his connections and his reputation to involve himself in a lucrative, low-violence criminal enterprise that spanned state lines. For Merlino, now in his mid-50s, this new indictment was a profound threat. It represented the potential end of his freedom and the definitive shattering of the life he had carefully rebuilt since his release. The trial, which took place in a federal courtroom in Manhattan, was a stark contrast to the dramatic, emotion-filled proceeding of 2001. The atmosphere was more clinical, focused on financial documents, phone records, and the testimony of a charismatic undercover FBI agent who had infiltrated the conspiracy. The defense mounted a vigorous counterattack, arguing that the government had no direct evidence of Merlino ordering any murders or engaging in traditional strong-arm mob tactics. They portrayed him as a retired figure, a celebrity who lived off his name and his legitimate business ventures, who was simply socially acquainted with the other defendants but was not an active participant in their criminal scheme. They argued that the government, obsessed with his reputation and stung by his previous acquittals on murder charges, was trying to ensnare him in a case built on guilt by association, attempting to convict him for who he was rather than for what he had actually done. The trial became a battle over the definition of a mob boss in the modern era. Was Merlino still a powerful criminal leader, or was he merely playing the part, a man living off his past notoriety while others conducted the real business of crime? The jury was tasked with deciphering a case built on circumstantial evidence and complex financial transactions, a far cry from the clear-cut violence of his first trial. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the result was, once again, a stunning and mixed verdict that perfectly encapsulated the enigmatic nature of Joey Merlino's career. He was acquitted on the most serious charges, including the lead racketeering conspiracy count that had been the foundation of the government's case. This was a monumental victory, a second time he had beaten the prosecution's primary allegation. However, in a twist that ensured the legal battle was not over, the jury deadlocked on several lesser counts, including fraud and conspiracy, resulting in a mistrial on those specific charges. The outcome was deeply frustrating for the government. They had failed to secure a definitive conviction, but they had also not exonerated him. Merlino walked out of the courtroom a free man, but he was not a cleared man. The specter of a retrial on the deadlocked charges hung over him, a lingering threat that promised more legal fees, more uncertainty, and the perpetual shadow of the justice system. This ambiguous conclusion felt like a metaphor for his entire life, neither fully victorious nor completely defeated, forever existing in a grey area between the world of crime and the world of freedom, a permanent resident of the legal and social limbo that he had, through a combination of cunning, charisma, and sheer resilience, learned to not only endure but to somehow manipulate to his own advantage, leaving both his admirers and his pursuers to wonder if the legend of Joey Merlino was ultimately untouchable by any court of law. The ambiguous outcome of the New York healthcare fraud trial left Joey Merlino in a state of legal purgatory, a strange and stressful limbo where he was technically a free man but perpetually under the threat of the government choosing to retry him on the deadlocked charges, a sword of Damocles hanging over the head of a man now entering his late 50s. This period was a test of endurance and a masterclass in the art of living under intense scrutiny, where every business deal, every social interaction, and every financial transaction was potentially being dissected by federal agents looking for any pretext to bring him back to court. Rather than retreat into the shadows, Merlino doubled down on the public persona he had so carefully cultivated, transforming himself from a mere mob boss into a full-fledged, self-aware celebrity, a character who seemed to be performing his own life for an audience of supporters, curious onlookers, and undoubtedly, the watchful eyes of the FBI. His social media presence became a central pillar of his life, a curated gallery of his daily existence. Photos of lavish meals at high-end steakhouses, videos from the golf course, cheerful birthday wishes to friends and family, and sun-drenched pictures from his frequent trips to Florida, where he had established a second home. He launched a line of branded merchandise, selling Joey Merlino t-shirts and hats, a move that was both a legitimate business venture and a brazen taunt to the authorities, monetising the very notoriety they had tried so hard to punish. He gave interviews to documentary filmmakers and journalists, always careful to never admit to any crimes, but always willing to play the part of the charming, reformed gangster, the last of a dying breed. He became a regular fixture on the celebrity fringe, photographed with actors, musicians, and sports figures, his life a seemingly endless parade of dinners, parties, and public appearances. This was a radical departure from every known model of mafia leadership. Where his predecessors had valued secrecy and anonymity, Merlino embraced the spotlight, understanding that in the 21st century, celebrity itself could be a form of armor, a source of power and income that was independent of the traditional, and now heavily monitored, criminal rackets. It created a fascinating paradox. The more public he became, the harder it was for the government to build a conventional case against him. How do you prosecute a man for running a secret criminal enterprise when his life is an open book, played out in real time on Instagram? This strategy, however, was not without its profound risks. It infuriated law enforcement, who saw it as a slap in the face, a public flaunting of their inability to finally convict him. It also alienated the more traditional old-school elements within the broader mafia, who viewed his behavior as a gross violation of the rules of omerta and a dangerous vanity that brought unwanted attention to everyone involved in that life. Back in Philadelphia, the operational control of the family's remaining rackets likely remained with the low-key, pragmatic faction loyal to Joseph Legambi and others, who continued to operate in the time-tested, quiet manner that had kept them out of prison. Merlino's role became increasingly symbolic and financial. He was the brand, the legendary figurehead who could open doors and attract business through his connections and his fearsome reputation, while others handled the gritty, day-to-day criminal labor. This bifurcation allowed him to maintain a veneer of legitimacy while still benefiting from the proceeds of the underworld. He invested in semi-legitimate businesses, including a popular South Philadelphia Italian restaurant, further blurring the lines between his criminal past and his entrepreneurial present. He was, in essence, trying to launder his life, not just his money, using fame and commerce to create a new identity that was untouchable. This final act of his long career was the most daring reinvention of all, from street thug to flashy boss, from federal inmate to media personality, and now, to a kind of elder statesman of a bygone era, a living relic who had somehow managed to outlast not only his rivals but the very archetype of the mobster he once embodied. He was no longer just surviving the game, he was changing the rules, crafting a legacy that was as much about perception and narrative as it was about power and crime, leaving the world to wonder if he was the last of the old-school gangsters or the first of an entirely new and unsettling modern hybrid. The final, and perhaps most telling, chapter in the long and turbulent saga of Joey Merlino's relationship with the American legal system unfolded not with the dramatic bang of a trial, but with the quiet, procedural whisper of a plea bargain, a strategic retreat that signaled a fundamental shift in the priorities of a man who had spent his entire life fighting the government with every fiber of his being. The lingering threat of a retrial on the deadlocked fraud charges from the 2016 case hung over him for years, a persistent cloud that no amount of social media sunshine could fully dispel. The prospect of enduring another costly, draining, and high-stakes legal battle, with the very real possibility of a conviction and a second lengthy prison term stretching into his 70s, forced a pragmatic calculation that his younger, more defiant self might never have considered. In early 2021, a resolution was finally reached. In a move that stunned many observers, Merlino agreed to plead guilty to a single count, conspiracy to commit illegal gambling. This was a staggering reduction from the original, sweeping racketeering and fraud charges that had carried the potential for decades behind bars. The plea deal was a masterpiece of legal negotiation, a testament to the weaknesses the government perceived in its own case for a retrial and Merlino's own desire for finality and a clean break from the relentless legal persecution. The sentencing was equally revealing. He was sentenced to a mere 2 years in prison, a mere fraction of the time he had already served, and given credit for time already served, which meant he would not have to spend a single additional day in a prison cell. For the prosecution, it was a symbolic victory, a final, official notation on his record that he was, indeed, a criminal. But for Merlino and his allies, it was an unqualified triumph. He had faced down the full might of the federal justice system for a second time and had emerged virtually unscathed, with his freedom intact and his future wide open. This plea deal was the closing of a circle, the final act in a 5-decade-long dance with the law. It provided him with something he had never truly possessed in his adult life, a sense of legal finality and closure. With this case resolved, there were no more looming indictments, no more active investigations specifically targeting him. For the first time, he could truly attempt to live a life that was not shadowed by the immediate threat of arrest and imprisonment. This hard-won freedom allowed him to fully embrace his self-crafted role as the retired, celebrity gangster, a living legend and a direct link to a grittier, more romanticized era of organized crime that had all but vanished from the American landscape. He became more active than ever in his public and business pursuits, his notoriety now a valuable and fully leveraged asset. His social media accounts evolved into a polished platform, a curated reality show of a man enjoying the fruits of a long and tumultuous life. He was no longer just a subject of documentaries. He became a commentator, an unofficial historian of his own world, offering opinions and anecdotes that were devoured by an audience fascinated by the authenticity of his experiences. He divided his time between his beloved South Philadelphia and his home in Florida, living a life of leisure that was a world away from the tense, paranoid existence of his youth. He was a regular at charity golf tournaments, a generous tipper at expensive restaurants, and a beloved local figure who was treated more like a returning hero than a former crime boss. This public adoration was a powerful shield, a form of social capital that made any future prosecution, for anything short of a major, violent crime, politically and practically difficult for any prosecutor to pursue. The legend of Skinny Joey had finally solidified into a permanent part of American folklore, a story of resilience, charisma, and an almost supernatural ability to evade the gravest consequences. He had outlived his enemies, outlasted his prosecutors, and had navigated the treacherous transition from the analog world of street corners and social clubs to the digital world of influencers and online personas. In doing so, Joey Merlino achieved a strange and unprecedented form of victory. He had not won by conquering his rivals or by building an impregnable criminal empire. He had won by surviving, by adapting, and by ultimately mastering the narrative of his own life, transforming himself from a public enemy into a peculiar kind of popular icon, a testament to the enduring, complicated, and often unsettling fascination that America holds for those who dare to live outside its laws, proving that in the modern world, the most powerful weapon is not always a gun, but sometimes a perfectly crafted story. To truly comprehend the enduring legacy of Joey Merlino, one must look beyond the court transcripts, the newspaper headlines, and the sensationalized tales of mob violence, and instead examine the more profound and subtle impact he has had on the very culture and mythology of organized crime in America. A legacy that is etched not only in the criminal record but in the shifting perceptions of a society increasingly disconnected from the realities of La Cosa Nostra. Merlino's story is, in many ways, the final, definitive chapter in the public saga of the traditional American Mafia, a narrative that began with the romanticized Prohibition-era gangsters and passed through the brutal corporate ruthlessness of the Five Families, arriving now at its twilight with a figure who is less a feared boss and more a curated personality, a self-aware artifact of a bygone era. His unprecedented embrace of the public sphere, his mastery of social media, and his transformation into a marketable brand represent a complete inversion of the core principles that once defined the mafioso: secrecy, anonymity, and omerta. Where his predecessors, men like Carlo Gambino or even his own nemesis Nicodemo Scarfo, operated from the shadows, cultivating power through fear and silence, Merlino operates in the blinding glare of the public spotlight, cultivating power through familiarity and fascination. He is not a mysterious Don, he is a content creator, his life a carefully managed performance that invites the world to look in, blurring the lines between notoriety and celebrity until they become virtually indistinguishable. This has fundamentally altered the public's relationship with the figure of the mob boss. He is no longer a monster lurking in the urban darkness, but a relatable, even likable, character who posts about his meals, his vacations, and his friends. A figure who seems more like a retired athlete or a reality television star than a man who was once the central figure in a bloody war for control of a criminal empire. This normalization of his image is perhaps his most significant and unsettling achievement, a feat that no other mob figure has ever managed to pull off. It has created a strange form of cognitive dissonance, where the gravity of his past actions, the alleged involvement in murders, the extortion, the violence, is softened by the benign and often charming persona he presents to the world today. He has become a symbol of survival, but also of sanitization, a living example of how time, charisma, and relentless self-promotion can sand down the sharp, dangerous edges of a violent history. For law enforcement, this presents an almost insurmountable challenge. How do you prosecute a man who has so thoroughly integrated himself into the mainstream, whose public image is one of affable retirement and legitimate business? The traditional methods of building a case, relying on terrified witnesses and the fear of mob retaliation, are less effective when the subject of the investigation is a popular local figure who is cheered at public events. The very nature of his current influence is diffuse and intangible, based on reputation and connection rather than direct, provable criminal orders. He has become a ghost in the machine of his own legend, his power derived from the story itself, a story that he now controls and narrates. This cultural legacy is complex and double-edged. On one hand, he is the last of his kind, the final boss to have risen through the ranks during the Mafia's last great era of power in the 1980s, a direct link to a world that has largely ceased to exist. In this, he is a historical figure, a subject of genuine academic and sociological interest. On the other hand, his success in rebranding himself raises difficult questions about our collective morality and our appetite for glamorizing criminality. The sale of Joey Merlino merchandise, the eager attendance at his public appearances, the fawning comments on his social media posts, all of this contributes to a narrative that often overlooks the victims of the criminal world he helped to lead, the businesses extorted, the lives ruined by loan sharking, the families shattered by the violence that was an intrinsic part of his rise to power. The blood that was spilled on the streets of Philadelphia during his war with John Stanfa is, in the glow of his present-day celebrity, too easily forgotten, washed away by the perceived glamour of his resilience and his flashy lifestyle. Joey Merlino, therefore, stands as a monumental and contradictory figure, a relic who is also a pioneer, a criminal who is also a celebrity, a man of violence who is now a purveyor of his own benign personal brand. His legacy is not set in stone but is a living, evolving thing, a story that he continues to write with every public post, every public appearance, and every interview. He has achieved a form of immortality, but it is an immortality that is intricately tied to the perception of his life rather than the stark reality of his deeds, leaving history to grapple with the complicated question of whether he is the last great gangster or simply the first to truly understand that in the 21st century, the most valuable territory to control is not the streets, but the story. The story of Joey Merlino, when stripped of its glamour and its notoriety, is ultimately a profound and enduring lesson in the nature of adaptation, a case study in how an individual, and by extension an entire criminal subculture, can evolve in the face of overwhelming external pressure and a rapidly changing world, demonstrating a resilience that is as much about intellectual flexibility as it is about physical courage or brute force. His journey from a street-level enforcer to a media-savvy brand is a roadmap of survival tactics, each phase of his life representing a distinct strategy for navigating the ever-present threats of rival gangs, internal betrayal, and most formidably, the relentless and technologically advanced apparatus of the federal government. In his youth, his adaptation was one of sheer, unadulterated ambition and violence, using fear and a reputation for ruthlessness to carve out a space for himself and his young executioners in the chaotic and bloody aftermath of the Scarfo era, understanding that in a world of sharks, one must become the most ferocious predator to avoid being eaten. This phase was defined by a traditional, almost primal, understanding of power. Power derived from the barrel of a gun and the willingness to use it without hesitation. However, the first major adaptation came when he witnessed the fatal flaw in this model. The unchecked violence of the Scarfo regime had created a legion of informants and had attracted the focused, destructive attention of the FBI, leading to the near-total collapse of the family. Merlino learned this lesson through fire, during his war with John Stanfa, where he combined this necessary violence with a new element, public relations. He cultivated a charismatic, almost Robin Hood-like image in South Philadelphia, becoming a man of the people while simultaneously waging a brutal underground war, understanding that the loyalty of a neighborhood could be as powerful a shield as a battalion of hitmen. His next, and perhaps most critical, adaptation was forced upon him by his 14-year prison sentence. Incarceration removed him from the streets but provided him with a forced sabbatical to observe, to reflect, and to plan. He saw that the world outside was changing, that technology was creating new vulnerabilities and new opportunities, and that the old, rigid hierarchies of the mafia were becoming obsolete. Upon his release, he did not simply attempt to reassert the old ways. He initiated his most radical transformation yet. He understood that in an era of total digital surveillance, where every phone could be tapped and every meeting could be recorded, the most effective way to operate was not in deeper secrecy, but in plain sight, using the tools of the modern world to his advantage. His embrace of social media was not merely a vanity project. It was a strategic masterstroke, a way to control his narrative, to build a public persona that was so open, so seemingly transparent, that it created a new kind of opacity. By sharing the mundane details of his life, he made his criminal past seem like a distant, almost fictional part of his story, a character he once played rather than the man he currently was. This was an adaptation of perception, a move that confounded law enforcement and captivated the public. Furthermore, his foray into semi-legitimate businesses, the restaurant, the merchandise, was an adaptation of his financial streams, creating legal revenue flows that were impervious to racketeering laws and that provided a plausible explanation for his lifestyle. He was diversifying his portfolio, moving from a purely criminal enterprise to a hybrid model, much like a corporation shifting its assets in response to market pressures and new regulations. His final adaptation was a psychological one, demonstrated in his decision to accept a plea bargain on a minor charge. This was the act of a mature strategist, not a young hothead. It was an acknowledgement that total victory over the government was impossible, and that the wiser course was to negotiate a favorable peace, to trade a minor admission of guilt for the priceless commodity of finality and freedom from future prosecution. This sequence of adaptations, from violent ambition, to charismatic leadership, to strategic public celebrity, to legitimate entrepreneur, and finally, to pragmatic negotiator, reveals a mind that is constantly processing, learning, and recalibrating. Joey Merlino's story, therefore, is not just a chronicle of a mobster's life. It is a textbook on evolutionary survival in a hostile environment. He serves as a living example that in any system, whether it be ecological, corporate, or criminal, The individuals who endure are not necessarily the strongest or the most violent, but those who are the most responsive to change, the most willing to shed outdated strategies, and the most adept at finding new ways to thrive when the old rules no longer apply. He adapted to the decay of the traditional mafia not by trying to resurrect it, but by building something new in its place, a legacy that is built as much on his ability to change as it is on his refusal to be defeated. To fully appreciate the complex tapestry of Joey Merlino's life and the indelible mark he has left on the American criminal landscape, one must also consider the profound and often overlooked human cost that forms the dark, unglamorous foundation upon which his legend was built, a sobering counter-narrative to the tale of resilience and celebrity that he so skillfully promotes. For every photograph of him smiling at a charity event, for every post showcasing a luxurious dinner, there exists a parallel, hidden history of suffering and loss that is an intrinsic and inescapable part of his story. The violence that propelled him to power was not an abstract concept or a plot point in a movie. It was a brutal, visceral reality that left lasting scars on families and communities throughout Philadelphia and beyond. The war with John Stanfa, while a testament to Merlino's tactical cunning and survival instincts, was also a period of terror for the city. A time when car bombs exploded on residential streets and drive-by shootings turned corners into killing zones, creating an atmosphere of fear that touched the lives of countless innocent bystanders who were simply trying to live their lives. The murder of his best friend, Michael Mikey Chang Sciencaglinia, was a personal tragedy for Merlino, but it was also a devastating loss for Sciencaglinia's own family. A wife widowed, children left without a father, parents forced to bury their son, a human ripple effect of grief that extended far beyond the insular world of the mob. And for every Mikey Chang, there were others, men like William Billy Vesey, whose lives were extinguished in the ruthless calculus of mob power struggles, men who were more than just names on an indictment or footnotes in a true crime story. They were sons, brothers, and fathers, whose deaths created voids that could never be filled. Beyond the murder victims were the countless other casualties of Merlino's criminal empire, the small business owners who were forced to pay tribute through extortion, seeing their hard-earned profits siphoned off by threats and intimidation. The desperate individuals caught in the inescapable trap of his loan-sharking operations, who found themselves facing exorbitant interest rates and the threat of broken bones if they failed to pay. The communities that were subtly corrupted by the pervasive influence of organized crime, where the shadow of the mob influenced local politics, stifled legitimate economic growth, and created a culture of silence and complicity. This is the other side of the Teflon Don mythos, the grimy reality that exists in the stark contrast to the shiny, curated social media feed. It is a reminder that the power and wealth he accumulated did not materialize from thin air. It was extracted, often through fear and coercion, from the very neighborhoods he now portrays himself as a patron of. His celebrated resilience came at a tremendous social cost, a cost that is too easily forgotten in the glow of his charismatic persona. Furthermore, the very act of his rebranding, his transformation into a celebrity, can be seen as a final, subtle form of erasure, a way of sanitizing a violent past and distancing himself from the consequences of his actions. By presenting himself as a charming, retired figure, he encourages the public to view his history as a thrilling drama rather than a chronicle of real-world harm. This is the ultimate adaptation, and perhaps the most controversial aspect of his legacy. Not just the evasion of prison, but the evasion of full accountability in the court of public perception. He has managed to craft a narrative where he is the protagonist, the survivor, the underdog who beat the system, while the victims of his organization's activities remain in the background, their stories untold and their pain unacknowledged. This does not diminish the fascinating complexity of his journey or his remarkable ability to endure, but it does demand that his story be viewed in its entirety, with a clear-eyed recognition of the suffering that was an essential ingredient in his rise. The legend of Joey Merlino is therefore a tale of two parallel realities. One is the public story of the charismatic survivor, the last celebrity mobster, a man who outsmarted the government and now enjoys the fruits of his notoriety. The other is a quieter, darker story of a criminal enterprise that left a trail of broken lives and communities in its wake. To understand the man is to hold both of these truths simultaneously, to see the charming dinner guest and the ruthless mob boss not as separate individuals, but as two facets of the same complex and contradictory human being. His life is a compelling saga of survival, but it is also a permanent and sobering reminder that behind every legendary outlaw, there are always the silent victims who paid the price for the legend. The twilight years of Joey Merlino's public life present a fascinating and unprecedented portrait of a man who has successfully transitioned from being a target of law enforcement to becoming a curator of his own museum, a living exhibit in the history of American organized crime, whose daily existence now serves as a continuous, real-time commentary on the legacy he has spent decades building. Now in his 60s, the frantic energy of his youth and the tense vigilance of his middle years have given way to a settled, almost pastoral rhythm of life, split between the familiar, brick and concrete embrace of South Philadelphia and the sun-drenched, leisurely pace of his Florida retreat. This is not the retirement of a forgotten man. It is the active, engaged retirement of a celebrity statesman, a figure who has made peace with his past and has learned to monetize and manage his notoriety with the skill of a seasoned public relations executive. His social media presence remains a cornerstone of this final act, but its tone has evolved. It is less about projecting invincibility and more about reinforcing a sense of normalcy and contentment. He shares pictures of family gatherings, celebrates the successes of his friends, offers restaurant recommendations, and posts reflective messages on holidays, crafting an image of a man who is at peace with himself and the world, a far cry from the hunted, paranoid figure he once was during the Stanfa War. This carefully constructed image of benevolent retirement is his final and most effective layer of insulation. It makes the idea of him as an active, threatening crime boss seem increasingly anachronistic and implausible to the general public, further complicating any future efforts by prosecutors to paint him as a current danger to society. He has become a beloved local institution in South Philadelphia, a walking piece of history who is greeted with handshakes and backslaps when he enters a restaurant, his presence a minor event that adds a thrill of authenticity to the dining experience of others. He has fully embraced the role of the last of his kind, and in doing so, he has achieved a level of cultural absorption that insulates him in a way that violence never could. The criminal underworld itself has continued to evolve in his absence from direct leadership, fracturing into smaller, more decentralized, and ethnically diverse crews focused on cybercrime, pharmaceutical fraud, and other high-profit, low-visibility enterprises that bear little resemblance to the neighborhood-based rackets of Merlino's prime. In this new landscape, his power is almost entirely symbolic. He is a revered ancestor, a founder figure whose opinions might be sought as a matter of respect, but whose day-to-day influence over the criminal economy of the city is likely minimal. This symbolic power, however, should not be mistaken for irrelevance. His name still carries immense weight, and his blessing, or lack thereof, can still hold sway in certain situations, a remnant of the fear and respect his name once commanded. His story is now taught in criminology classes, analyzed in documentaries, and debated by historians, his life having transcended the confines of the crime blotter to become a subject of academic and cultural study. He has outlived the era that created him, and in doing so, he has become a bridge to a past that is rapidly receding from living memory. The young men who now dominate the underworld are not products of the same tight-knit, code-bound immigrant communities that forged the mafia. They are entrepreneurs of chaos, often operating anonymously online, their loyalties shifting with the financial winds. Joey Merlino stands as a monument to a different time, a time when organized crime had a face, a name, and a neighborhood, when power was asserted on street corners and in social clubs rather than in the encrypted channels of the dark web. His continued presence is a constant, living reminder of that transition, a human landmark in the rapidly changing cityscape of both Philadelphia and of American crime itself. He is enjoying the autumn of his years not as a forgotten relic, but as a celebrated and active participant in the narrative of his own life, having successfully navigated the most improbable of journeys from the violent, volatile streets of his youth to the calm, curated shores of his present, a testament to the sheer, unyielding force of a will to survive, to adapt, and ultimately, to define the story that will be told long after he is gone. The philosophical underpinnings of Joey Merlino's long and turbulent journey through the upper echelons of American organized crime reveal a man who ultimately operated less as an ideologue of La Cosa Nostra and more as a pure, unadulterated capitalist entrepreneur, a businessman whose product happened to be illicit, but whose strategies for market dominance, brand management, and risk assessment were as sophisticated as any Fortune 500 CEO. If one strips away the violence and the specific criminal context, the blueprint of his career mirrors that of a disruptive startup challenging an established, stagnant corporation. The old Philadelphia family under Angelo Bruno was the legacy corporation, stable but uninnovative, operating on outdated models. Nicodemo Scarfo was the hostile takeover, a brutal and inefficient manager whose leadership style created massive employee turnover and attracted the attention of heavy-handed regulators. Joey Merlino, leading his young executioners, was the disruptive new venture, agile, tech-savvy, and unburdened by the old corporate culture, who saw a market opportunity in the chaos and moved to fill the void. His entire approach can be analyzed through a business lens. His initial market entry was through violent competition, eliminating his rival, John Stanfa, in a brutal corporate takeover battle. His brand identity was his flashy, charismatic public persona, the Teflon Don, which differentiated him from the drab, secretive old guard and attracted a certain consumer loyalty on the streets. His risk management was his masterful use of insulation, using layers of associates to handle direct criminal transactions while he managed the overall strategy and public relations, much like a CEO who remains purposefully distant from the day-to-day operations of a subsidiary to maintain plausible deniability. His period of incarceration was a forced sabbatical, a time for corporate restructuring and strategic planning for re-entry into a changed marketplace. And his most brilliant maneuver, his pivot in the 2010s, was a classic corporate rebranding and diversification strategy. Facing intense regulatory pressure on his core product lines, traditional rackets like extortion and gambling, he diversified his revenue streams. He launched new product lines in the form of branded merchandise and restaurant ventures. He shifted his marketing strategy from word of mouth on street corners to a global digital campaign via social media, expanding his brand recognition and opening up new, legitimate revenue channels. His eventual plea bargain on a minor charge was not an admission of defeat, but a strategic settlement of a costly and distracting lawsuit, allowing the company, his life and legacy, to continue operating with a cleanish slate and a renewed focus on its most profitable and sustainable ventures. This analytical framework demystifies Merlino and places him squarely within the broader narrative of American ambition. He was, at his core, an exceptional businessman who recognized that the old monopoly held by traditional organized crime families was crumbling and that the future belonged to those who could adapt, rebrand, and leverage new technologies. His fundamental driving force was not a blind allegiance to a Sicilian code of honor, but a relentless pursuit of profit and status within the framework available to him. He understood that power in the modern world is as much about narrative and perception as it is about physical dominance. He was selling a story, and the story was his own life, a product that proved to be incredibly marketable. This capitalist interpretation does not excuse his crimes or the suffering he caused, but it does provide a clearer, more dispassionate lens through which to understand his actions and his remarkable longevity. He was not the last great romantic gangster. He was the first fully modern criminal entrepreneur, a hybrid figure who operated in the grey area between the underworld and the mainstream, applying the principles of business management to the art of survival in a high-stakes, illegal industry. His legacy, therefore, is not just a criminal one. It is a case study in adaptive business strategy, a demonstration of how to pivot in the face of existential threats, how to manage a toxic brand, and how to ultimately secure a profitable and stable retirement after a lifetime of operating in the most volatile market conditions imaginable. He proved that the principles of capitalism are agnostic, that they can be applied just as effectively to running a criminal syndicate as to running a tech startup, and that the most successful players in any field are those who see change not as a threat, but as the ultimate opportunity. The intricate and often contradictory relationship between Joey Merlino and the city of Philadelphia itself forms a critical chapter in this saga, a symbiotic and sometimes parasitic bond between a man and his hometown that shaped both his identity and the city's own underworld mythology, creating a feedback loop of notoriety and local pride that is unique in the annals of American crime. Philadelphia, with its gritty, blue-collar heart, its deep-seated neighborhood loyalties, and its history of political corruption and tough guy culture, provided the perfect petri dish for a figure like Merlino to flourish. He was not an import or an outsider. He was a pure product of the city's environment, embodying its defiant, underdog spirit, its loud and unapologetic character, and its deep-rooted sense of territoriality. South Philadelphia, in particular, was more than just his base of operations. It was his sanctuary, his stage, and his source of power. The tight-knit row houses, the intimate corner shops, and the generations-deep family networks created a human shield around him, a community that understood the unwritten rules of silence and loyalty, not necessarily out of fear, but often out of a twisted form of civic pride. To many in his neighborhood, Joey Merlino wasn't just a gangster, he was their gangster, a local boy who made good on a grand, if illicit, scale, a man who never forgot his roots and who was often generous to those in his community, contributing to neighborhood causes and being a visible, approachable presence. This local support system was a tangible asset, a form of capital that could not be bought but had to be earned through years of embedded presence. It meant that witnesses were hesitant to come forward, that juries were potentially sympathetic, and that he could walk the streets with a level of security that no bodyguard could ever provide. In return, Merlino gave Philadelphia a certain kind of dark glamour, a connection to a national narrative of organized crime that was otherwise dominated by New York and Chicago. He put the Philadelphia mob back on the map, making it relevant and feared in a way it hadn't been since the Bruno era. His flashy style, his defiance of the law, and his dramatic survival stories became a source of perverse civic identity for some, a symbol that their city could produce figures as larger than life as any from the 5 boroughs of New York. The city, in a sense, lived vicariously through his rebellions. This relationship, however, was not without its dark ironies. The same city that provided him with cover and a form of adulation was also the primary victim of his criminal enterprise. The neighborhoods he claimed to champion were the very ones preyed upon by his loan sharks and extortionists. The small businesses that formed the backbone of the local economy were the ones forced to pay him tribute. The violence that cemented his legend spilled onto the streets where families lived and children played, creating trauma and fear that lasted for generations. The city was both his benefactor and his victim, a schizophrenic dynamic that continues to define his memory there. Even today, as a retired figure, his presence is a point of contention and fascination. He is a tourist attraction, a piece of living history that draws the curious to the restaurants he frequents. His name is whispered with a mix of awe, fear, and a peculiar fondness. He represents a Philadelphia that is rapidly changing, a city of distinct, insular neighborhoods that is giving way to a more homogenized, gentrified metropolis. In this way, he is a monument to the city's past, a reminder of a grittier, more chaotic, and in some ways more authentically connected urban life. The story of Joey Merlino is, therefore, inseparable from the story of Philadelphia in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. He is a character that the city produced, for better or worse, a reflection of its strengths and its flaws, its loyalties and its corruptions. To understand him is to understand something essential about the city that created him, a place where family and neighborhood mean everything, where defiance is a virtue, and where the line between a local hero and a civic menace can be as thin as a shadow on a South Philly street corner. He is Philadelphia's most famous and complicated son, a permanent part of its folklore, his legacy woven as inextricably into the fabric of the city as the cracks in the Liberty Bell or the passion of its sports fans. A dark star in the constellation of the city's identity, whose light, however troubling, will never fully fade. The role of the media, both traditional and new, in the construction and perpetuation of the Joey Merlino legend cannot be overstated, serving as a powerful and willing accomplice in the crafting of a narrative that often blurred the lines between objective reporting and sensationalized myth-making, creating a feedback loop where his notoriety fed the news cycle and the news cycle, in turn, amplified his notoriety, elevating him from a local crime figure to a national icon of mob resilience. From the very beginning of his rise during the bloody Merlino-Stanfa War, the Philadelphia newspapers and local television news were fixated on the young, charismatic challenger, dubbing him Skinny Joey and portraying the conflict not just as a criminal power struggle but as a dramatic, generational showdown with a clear protagonist and antagonist. The press ate up his flashy style, his audacious attempts on Stanfa's life, and his ability to evade capture, turning police blotter entries into front-page headlines that read like chapters in an ongoing crime thriller. This coverage was instrumental in building his Teflon Don reputation long before it was ever truly tested in a major court case. The media created the legend, and Merlino, with his innate understanding of public perception, was more than happy to play the part. He learned to use the press as a tool, giving calculated quotes, projecting an image of unflappable confidence even when he was a fugitive, and understanding that every newspaper article and television segment was free advertising for his brand of fearless leadership. This symbiotic relationship reached its zenith during his first major racketeering trial in 2001, which was covered as a high-stakes legal drama, with reporters dissecting his every courtroom expression and fashion choice, further cementing his status as a celebrity defendant rather than just another accused gangster. But it was in the post-prison era that Merlino's relationship with the media evolved into something entirely new and revolutionary. He bypassed the traditional gatekeepers of newspapers and television entirely and became his own publisher, his own spin doctor, and his own documentarian through the direct-to-consumer platform of social media. Instagram became his personal television network, a curated reality show where he could control every frame of the narrative. No longer reliant on a reporter's possibly critical or nuanced interpretation, he could present his life exactly as he wanted it to be seen. A life of luxury, leisure, family values, and neighborhood loyalty. This was a monumental shift in power. He was no longer just a subject of the media. He was a competing media entity. He offered his followers an intimate, unfiltered look into his world, and in doing so, he built a massive audience that was emotionally invested in his story, an audience that saw the human being behind the headlines. This direct connection fostered a powerful sense of parasocial intimacy, making it difficult for his followers to reconcile the charming, grandfatherly figure posting birthday wishes with the violent mob boss of federal indictments. Furthermore, he began to engage with traditional media on his own terms, participating in documentaries and interviews where he could carefully control the narrative, always affable, always denying direct involvement in the worst crimes, always presenting himself as a man who had paid his debt to society and was now focused on his family and his legitimate businesses. The media, for its part, often played along, fascinated by his access and his charisma, sometimes glossing over the darker chapters of his past in favor of the compelling, redemptive arc he was selling. This complex dance has had a profound impact on his legacy. The media's initial sensationalism helped create the monster, and its later fascination with his celebrity helped tame him in the public eye, transforming him from a public enemy into a folk hero. The story of Joey Merlino is, therefore, also a story about the power of narrative and our collective complicity in its creation. We, the audience, through our consumption of true crime documentaries, our clicks on articles about his latest dinner, and our follows on his social media accounts, are active participants in the perpetuation of his myth. We have voted with our attention, and we have chosen the story of the charming survivor over the story of the ruthless criminal. The media provided the stage and the spotlight, but it is our enduring fascination that has kept Joey Merlino in the limelight for over 4 decades, proving that in the modern world, the most dangerous weapon is not a gun, but a compelling story, and the most valuable territory is not a city block, but the limitless landscape of the public imagination. The psychological portrait of Joey Merlino that emerges from the totality of his life and choices is one of profound complexity, a tapestry woven with threads of immense charisma, a deep-seated need for respect, a pragmatic and almost cold-blooded capacity for violence, and a survival instinct so finely honed it borders on the preternatural, creating a man who is both a product of his environment and a singular anomaly within it, a figure whose motivations can only be understood by delving into the subconscious drivers that propelled him from a South Philadelphia street corner to the status of an American anti-hero. At his core, from his earliest days, Merlino exhibited what can only be described as a pathological aversion to powerlessness, a driving force born from witnessing his father's own rise and fall within the volatile world of the mob, a childhood lesson that taught him that in their world, you were either the predator or the prey, and that there was no safe, neutral ground. This foundational fear of being subjugated, of being at the mercy of another man's whim like his father was under Scarfo, fueled an ambition that was not merely about wealth, but about absolute autonomy and control over his own destiny. His charisma was not just a personality trait, it was a strategic weapon, a tool to attract loyal followers, to disarm potential enemies, and to build the social capital that would form a protective barrier around him. This need for admiration and respect, both from his criminal peers and from the wider community, points to a deep-seated narcissism, a belief in his own exceptionalism that allowed him to navigate situations that would have broken other men. He truly believed he was smarter, tougher, and more destined for greatness than those around him, and this unshakable self-confidence became a self-fulfilling prophecy, inspiring the loyalty and fear that cemented his power. Yet, this same ego had to be constantly tempered by a hyper-vigilant, calculating pragmatism. The man who could be so publicly flamboyant was also the man who could disappear into the shadows for years as a fugitive, who could speak in intricate codes to avoid wiretaps, and who could ultimately plead guilty to a minor charge to secure his long-term freedom. This duality, the flamboyant performer and the secretive strategist, suggests a mind capable of holding 2 contradictory realities at once, a psychological flexibility that is the hallmark of the most successful survivors in any high-stakes field. His relationship with violence is another critical facet of his psyche. He was clearly capable of ordering and endorsing brutal acts, as the allegations from the Stanfa war attest, yet he seemed to lack the pathological, almost recreational bloodlust of a Nicodemo Scarfo. For Merlino, violence was primarily a business tool, a necessary means to a strategic end, to eliminate a rival, to enforce discipline, to send a message. It was a calculus, not a compulsion. This distinction is crucial. It allowed him to later rebrand himself as a non-violent figure, because in his own mind, the violence was never the point, it was just an unfortunate cost of doing business in his chosen industry. This ability to compartmentalize, to wall off the moral consequences of his actions, allowed him to live with himself and to present a coherent, even charming, face to the world. Furthermore, his entire journey can be seen as a relentless pursuit of what psychologists term agency, the power to act independently and to exert control over one's environment. Every major decision, from challenging Stanfa, to embracing social media, to taking the plea deal, was an assertion of his own agency in the face of overwhelming opposition from rivals, the law, and the passage of time itself. He refused to be a passive passenger in his own life, even when the safest course would have been to submit. This fierce, almost rebellious insistence on self-determination is what makes his story so compelling to a wide audience. It taps into a universal human desire to control our own fate. Finally, his later life transformation into a media-friendly personality reveals a man who is not just surviving, but who is actively engaged in the construction of his own legacy. He is writing the final chapter of his story with a clear eye on history, attempting to shape how he will be remembered long after he is gone. This is the act of a man who understands the power of narrative over fact, and who is making a final, psychological bid for a form of immortality that transcends the grim realities of his criminal record. Joey Merlino is, therefore, a psychological puzzle. A narcissist with the common touch, a violent man who craves admiration, a pragmatic survivor with a romantic sense of his own legend. He is a bundle of contradictions that somehow, against all odds, cohered into a single, formidable identity that managed to navigate the most dangerous waters imaginable, not just through brute force or luck, but through a deep, albeit unorthodox, understanding of the intricate mechanics of power, perception, and the human psyche itself. The global context of organized crime during Joey Merlino's lifetime provides a crucial and often overlooked backdrop to his story, framing his journey not just as a local Philadelphia saga but as a single, vivid data point in the worldwide transformation of illicit enterprises from territorially bound, ethnic-based hierarchies to fluid, decentralized, and globally connected networks. A shift that his career both reflected and, in its final stages, presciently anticipated. When Merlino first entered the underworld in the late 1970s and 1980s, the landscape was still largely defined by the old models. The Italian Mafia, the Chinese Triads, the Japanese Yakuza all operated on similar principles of strict codes, ethnic purity, and control over specific geographic territories and traditional rackets like protection, gambling, and narcotics. The Philadelphia family was a microcosm of this global order, a franchise of a larger, but still identifiable, Italian-American criminal consortium. Merlino's early battles with Scarfo and Stanfa were, in essence, internal succession wars within this dying paradigm, fights over who would control the same few city blocks and the same aging portfolio of criminal ventures. The tools were guns and car bombs. The battlefield was the neighborhood. However, even as Merlino was fighting these parochial wars, the ground was shifting beneath his feet on a planetary scale. The fall of the Berlin Wall, the opening of global markets, and the dawn of the digital age created unprecedented opportunities for a new breed of criminal. Russian oligarchs plundered state assets, Mexican cartels industrialized drug trafficking with terrifying violence, and cybercriminals in anonymous Eastern European basements began to devise schemes that could steal millions with a single click. These new entities were not bound by neighborhood loyalties or ethnic codes. They were purely pragmatic, often violently so, and their operations were borderless. The American Mafia, with its rigid structures and insistence on tradition, was suddenly an analog relic in a digital world, a slow, heavy battleship surrounded by fleets of fast, nimble speedboats. Merlino's great, albeit unconscious, insight was to recognize, perhaps through the forced reflection of his long incarceration, that the Philadelphia family could not compete on this new global stage by playing by the old rules. His post-2011 strategy can be seen as a deliberate, if instinctive, downsizing and rebranding in response to these global pressures. He understood that the family's future did not lie in trying to compete with international cartels for control of drug routes or in engaging in bloody turf wars that only attracted federal attention. Instead, he pivoted towards a hybrid model. He maintained a foothold in the local, low-level rackets that were beneath the notice of global competitors but provided a steady cash flow, while simultaneously exploring the kind of white-collar, multi-jurisdictional fraud that was the hallmark of modern crime, as evidenced by his involvement in the national healthcare scam. This was not the work of a traditional mafioso. It was the work of a criminal portfolio manager, diversifying his assets. His embrace of social media and celebrity was the ultimate adaptation to this new, borderless reality. A traditional mob boss's power was local, but Merlino's brand became global. His Instagram followers from around the world may not have been able to find South Philadelphia on a map, but they knew the legend of Joey Merlino. This global recognition created a form of power that was detached from physical territory, a valuable intangible asset in the modern economy. In this sense, Joey Merlino stopped being just a Philadelphia mob boss and became a global microbrand, a niche player in the vast, interconnected marketplace of illicit and semi-illicit enterprise. His story, therefore, is a bridge between two eras. He is one of the last significant figures to have risen to power through the classic, violent methods of the 20th century mafia, but he is also one of the first to have successfully navigated the transition into the 21st century economy of attention and information. He could not beat the globalized competition, so he joined it on his own terms, leveraging the one unique asset he had that the Russian mob and the cybercriminals did not: his name, his face, and his story. He commodified his own anachronistic status, selling the romance of the old-school gangster to a world that had moved on to far more dangerous and anonymous criminal threats. In the grand, grim theater of global organized crime, Joey Merlino's final act was not to rule an empire, but to become a living museum exhibit, a curated performance of a vanishing world, proving that even in the face of overwhelming global change, there is still a market, however niche, for a well-told story and a legendary name. The intricate and perpetually escalating technological chess match between Joey Merlino and the law enforcement agencies dedicated to his downfall forms a critical, behind-the-scenes narrative that runs parallel to his more public story of rise, fall, and reinvention. A clandestine war of wits and wires that evolved from simple physical surveillance to a dizzying array of digital espionage tools, forcing Merlino to constantly adapt his methods of communication and operation in a desperate bid to maintain his freedom. In the early days, the tactics were almost quaint by modern standards. FBI agents in unmarked cars would tail his vehicle, conducting rolling surveillance through the narrow streets of South Philadelphia, while other agents would sit in stale-smelling vans parked across from his social clubs, using long-range lenses to photograph everyone who came and went, painstakingly building a web of associations and patterns of life. The primary weapon in the government's arsenal was the wiretap, a physical bug planted in a car or a clubroom, a device that required risky, covert entry operations and which produced reels of magnetic tape filled with hours of often frustratingly coded and ambiguous conversations. Merlino and his crew became adept at speaking in a language of veiled references and metaphors, discussing recipes for violence and business deals that were actually criminal plots, a linguistic dance designed to provide plausible deniability if the tapes were ever played in a courtroom. This was the first level of the technological duel. The stakes were raised dramatically with his 2001 racketeering trial, where the evidence included not just these traditional wiretaps but also the devastating testimony of turncoats who had been wired with body recorders, a technology that brought the FBI directly into the room for damning, face-to-face conversations. Merlino's subsequent 14-year prison sentence was a direct result of his inability to fully counter these analog-era surveillance methods. When he emerged in 2011, the technological landscape had been utterly transformed, and the second, more sophisticated phase of the duel began. The unmarked cars were now supplemented with license plate readers mounted on poles throughout the city, automatically logging his every movement into a vast database. The physical wiretaps were joined, and in many cases replaced, by a suite of digital tools that were far more pervasive and insidious. The FBI now had the capability, with court approval, to deploy stingray devices that could mimic cell phone towers, sucking up data from every mobile phone in a target area, including his. They could potentially access his emails and track his location in real time through the GPS in his smartphone. They could use sophisticated software to analyze his financial transactions, spotting patterns invisible to the human eye. The social media presence he so carefully cultivated was a double-edged sword. While it was a tool for his rebranding, it was also a goldmine for federal analysts, who could mine his posts for information about his associates, his spending habits, and his movements, all provided voluntarily by the target himself. Merlino's adaptation to this new reality was, once again, remarkably agile. He was known to use burner phones, disposable mobile devices that were frequently discarded to break tracking patterns. He reportedly avoided discussing sensitive matters on any electronic device, reverting to the old-school method of in-person, walk-and-talk conversations in open, noisy spaces where surveillance was more difficult. His very public lifestyle became, in a strange way, a counter-surveillance tactic. By living so openly, he created a flood of data, making it harder for investigators to separate the significant signal from the overwhelming noise of his daily life. The 2016 healthcare fraud case was a prime example of this new battlefield. The evidence was not from a bug in a South Philly social club, but from a multi-state undercover operation that tracked financial wire transfers and recorded conversations in New York, demonstrating how the scope of investigations had expanded far beyond a single city's borders. That Merlino managed to secure a mistrial on the major charges in this technologically advanced case is a testament to his and his legal team's ability to fight on this new, complex terrain. This endless technological arms race illustrates a fundamental truth about modern law enforcement and modern crime. The tools change, but the core conflict endures. The FBI evolved from tape reels to data algorithms, and Merlino evolved from coded language to burner phones and a strategy of radical transparency. It was a perpetual cycle of action and reaction, with each side developing new countermeasures to the other's latest advancements. This hidden war of technology is as much a part of his legacy as the flashy cars and the courtroom dramatics. It is the story of a traditional criminal navigating, and for a long time surviving, the digital revolution, a testament to his relentless ingenuity in the face of an increasingly omniscient and technologically empowered adversary. He was a 20th century mobster who managed to prolong his career deep into the 21st century not by outgunning his opponents, but by outthinking them in a silent, invisible war conducted in the ether of radio waves and digital signals. The concept of loyalty, that most sacred and frequently invoked tenet of the Mafia's code of honor, known as omerta, takes on a deeply complex and ultimately tragic character in the story of Joey Merlino, becoming a fluid and negotiable commodity rather than an absolute principle, a theme that runs through his entire career like a cracked bell, its ring forever tarnished by the pervasive reality of betrayal and the pragmatic necessities of survival. In the idealized version of La Cosa Nostra that Merlino was taught as a young man, loyalty was supposed to be absolute, unwavering, and more valuable than life itself, binding men together in a sacred brotherhood that placed the family above individual interest and demanded silence even in the face of death. The reality he experienced, however, was a brutal and continuous deconstruction of this romantic myth. He saw firsthand how the fanatical loyalty demanded by Nicodemo Scarfo bred not steadfastness, but a culture of such intense paranoia that it turned trusted nephews like Philip Leonetti into the government's most devastating witnesses. He learned that the oath of omerta was often the first thing to be discarded when faced with the prospect of life in a federal supermax prison. His own rise was predicated on a fierce loyalty to his father and his small, tight-knit crew of young executioners, a bond forged in the fire of the Scarfo persecution and tempered in the bloody war against John Stanfa. This inner circle, with figures like Michael Mikey Chang Caglinia, represented a genuine brotherhood, a belief that they were different, that their loyalty was pure and unbreakable. The death of Mikey Chang, a man killed specifically because of his loyalty to Merlino, was a devastating blow that underscored the ultimate price this world could demand for such devotion. Yet, even as he grieved for his friend, the machinery of betrayal was constantly grinding around him. The federal case that eventually sent him to prison for 14 years was built largely on the testimony of former associates, men who had broken their oaths and chosen to cooperate with the government to save themselves. This experience in the courtroom, listening to men he had once broken bread with detail his alleged crimes for a reduced sentence, must have been a profound and disillusioning education in the true nature of loyalty in the modern American Mafia. It demonstrated that the code was, for most, a temporary convenience, a shield that was quickly abandoned when it became a liability. This harsh lesson fundamentally shaped his leadership style after his release from prison. He no longer operated with the expectation of blind, traditional loyalty from a large organization. Instead, he relied on a much smaller, more carefully vetted circle, and he diversified his operations to rely less on human trust and more on structural insulation and legal business ventures. His own public persona became a strategic replacement for the old bonds of loyalty. He cultivated a brand of personal charisma and neighborhood generosity that inspired a different, more diffuse form of allegiance from the public, a loyalty based on admiration and perceived benevolence that was far less risky than the blood oaths of the underworld. The final, ironic twist in the theme of loyalty in Merlino's life is his own relationship with the code. While he demanded it from his subordinates and was often portrayed as a victim of betrayal, his entire post-prison strategy could be viewed as a form of high-level disloyalty to the traditional mafia itself. His very public lifestyle, his social media presence, his monetization of his notoriety, all of these actions were a blatant violation of the core principle of secrecy that was the bedrock of omerta. In the eyes of many old-school mafiosi, he was betraying the life itself by turning it into a public spectacle. He was loyal, in the end, not to a code or an organization, but to his own survival and his own legacy. The story of loyalty in the world of Joey Merlino is therefore not one of steadfast honor, but of its systematic erosion. It is a story that begins with the ideal of a sacred brotherhood, is tested by the fires of war and prison, and ultimately ends with a pragmatic, almost cynical understanding that in the end, every man is ultimately loyal to himself. The cracked bell of Omerta, which once rang with the promise of honor and silence, now sits silent, a museum piece in the curated exhibit of his life, a reminder of a power that was ultimately broken not by external enemies, but by the internal, corrosive realization that the code was, and perhaps always had been, a beautiful and deadly fiction. The final and perhaps most enduring question surrounding Joey Merlino's long and tumultuous life is not whether he was a successful criminal, for his lengthy resume of racketeering convictions and alleged crimes answers that definitively, but rather what his ultimate legacy will be once the final chapter is written and the story is passed into history, a complex inheritance that will be fought over by historians, journalists, his remaining admirers, and his countless detractors, a legacy that seems to shift and change depending on the angle from which it is viewed, presenting a different facet to a neighborhood resident in South Philadelphia than it does to an FBI agent or a cultural critic. For the people of his beloved South Philadelphia, his legacy is likely to remain one of a local boy who made good, a folk hero who never forgot where he came from, a symbol of neighborhood loyalty and defiant resilience against the overwhelming power of the federal government, a man whose charitable acts and constant presence lent a touch of old-world glamour and notoriety to the community, a living link to a grittier, more defined past. For law enforcement, his legacy is that of a resilient and frustratingly adaptable adversary, a man who represented the last significant gasp of the traditional Philadelphia La Cosa Nostra, but whose ability to evolve and rebrand himself demonstrated the challenges of prosecuting organized crime in the modern era. A case study in the transition from brute force to sophisticated financial schemes and the use of celebrity as a shield. For students of organized crime, his legacy is that of a pivotal transitional figure, the man who bridged the gap between the bloody, insular world of Scarfo and Stanfa and the modern, decentralized, and hybrid model of criminal entrepreneurship, a boss who understood that the future was in branding and semi-legitimate business ventures long before many of his contemporaries. For the families of his victims, both those who were murdered and those whose lives were damaged by his extortion and loan sharking, his legacy is one of pain and loss, a reminder of the human cost of his ambition, a cost that is too often glossed over in the glamorous retelling of his story. For the wider American public, who have consumed his story through news reports, documentaries, and his own social media feed, his legacy is the most mythologized. He is the Teflon Don, the last celebrity mobster, a real-life character from a Scorsese film who somehow walked off the screen and into the digital age, a symbol of a bygone era of crime that was somehow more personal and less anonymous than the cybercrimes and international cartels that dominate the headlines today. His story taps into a deep-seated American fascination with the outlaw, the self-made man who operates by his own rules, and his ultimate survival offers a strange kind of catharsis, a narrative that suggests that individuality and charisma can, against all odds, triumph over the cold, impersonal machinery of the state. Yet, this very mythologizing is the most contentious part of his legacy. By successfully rebranding himself, has he managed to launder his own history, sanitizing the violence and corruption that were the foundations of his power? Has his charming, grandfatherly social media presence effectively erased the memory of the young man at the center of a brutal gang war? The answer likely lies in a synthesis of all these perspectives. Joey Merlino's legacy is not a single, monolithic thing. It is a mosaic, a collection of broken and often contradictory pieces that, when viewed from a distance, form a picture of late 20th and early 21st century America itself. Its obsession with fame, its complex relationship with crime, its shifting urban landscapes, and its relentless, often contradictory, pursuit of the American dream by any means necessary. He will be remembered not as a purely evil villain or a romantic hero, but as a profoundly human, deeply flawed, and extraordinarily resilient product of a specific time and place who managed to navigate a half-century of immense social and technological change by relying on his wits, his charisma, and his unwavering will to survive. His ultimate legacy is the story itself, a sprawling, ambiguous, and endlessly fascinating American epic that will be told and retold, argued over and analyzed, long after the man himself is gone, ensuring that the name Joey Merlino will echo far beyond the street corners of South Philadelphia, a permanent and complicated footnote in the vast and dark history of the American underworld. The story of Joey Merlino, when viewed not as a sequence of criminal acts or legal battles but as a single, sprawling narrative arc, reveals itself to be a profound and modern American epic, a saga that encapsulates some of the nation's most deep-seated and contradictory mythologies, from the self-made man and the rebellious outlaw to the charismatic entrepreneur and the ultimate survivor. A story that holds a dark mirror up to the very ideals of success, loyalty, and reinvention that form the bedrock of the national identity. His journey from the son of a mobster in a tight-knit Philadelphia neighborhood to a nationally recognized figure, whose name evokes a complex mixture of fear, respect, and fascination, is a narrative that could only have unfolded in the particular cultural and historical context of the United States, a country perpetually obsessed with second acts and the power of an individual to shape his own destiny, regardless of the means employed. The classic American narrative is one of rising from nothing, of pulling oneself up by the bootstraps, and in his own twisted way, Merlino did exactly that. He took the raw materials of his birth, a famous name, a neighborhood territory, a legacy of violence, and through sheer force of will, tactical genius, and an unshakable belief in his own exceptionalism, built an empire of illicit influence and a personal brand of remarkable durability. He is the dark counterpart to the Horatio Alger myth, a man who achieved a form of the American dream, complete with wealth, fame, and power, but who did so by operating in the shadows and exploiting the very fabric of his community. His story also taps into the enduring American fascination with the outlaw, the figure who exists outside the law, challenging authority and living by his own code. From Billy the Kid to Al Capone, America has always had a soft spot for the charismatic criminal, and Merlino, with his flashy suits, his defiance in the face of federal prosecution, and his ability to walk away from multiple murder charges, fit this archetype perfectly, updating it for a new generation. He was not a remote, mythical figure from a history book. He was a contemporary, a man you could see on television, and later, a personality you could follow online, making his story feel immediate and visceral. Furthermore, his remarkable ability to reinvent himself, from violent enforcer to fugitive, from prison inmate to celebrity restaurateur and social media influencer, is a uniquely American trope, the belief that one can always start over, that the past does not have to define the future. This narrative of redemption and reinvention is a powerful undercurrent in the national psyche, and Merlino's life is a masterclass in its execution, even if the redemption was more about public perception than moral transformation. He understood that in America, the story is often more important than the facts, and he became a master storyteller, the author of his own legend. His life also reflects the country's complex and often hypocritical relationship with capitalism. He was, at his core, a ruthless and brilliant businessman who identified market inefficiencies in gambling, in lending, in fraud, and exploited them for maximum profit. He understood branding, public relations, and risk management with the acumen of a corporate raider. That his business was illegal does not negate the fact that his methods were a dark reflection of the cutthroat entrepreneurial spirit that America often celebrates. He was the ultimate disruptor, challenging the established corporate structure of the old mafia and pivoting his business model in response to market pressures from both rivals and law enforcement. In this sense, his story is a cautionary tale about the potential for the principles of capitalism, when utterly unmoored from ethics or the rule of law, to create a monster of efficiency and resilience. Joey Merlino's life, therefore, is more than just a biography of a mobster. It is a dark reflection of the American soul, a story that explores our collective appetite for violence and glamour, our deep-seated belief in second chances, our worship of success at any cost, and our enduring, complicated love affair with the man who stands outside the rules and writes his own. He is a character who could only have been forged in the fires of American ambition, and his long, tumultuous, and ultimately successful fight for survival ensures that his story will remain, for better or worse, a permanent and unsettling part of the nation's folklore, a reminder that the American dream has many faces, and some of them, while charming and charismatic, gaze out from the shadows of a criminal past that can never be fully escaped, only cleverly repackaged for a world eager to be entertained by the darkness. And so, the long and resonant echo of Joey Merlino's life settles not with a definitive judgment or a simple moral, but with the lingering, haunting hum of a story that is, in its entirety, a profound meditation on the very nature of survival in a world that is constantly seeking to erase you. From the moment he stepped out from his father's shadow, a skinny kid with a bottomless ambition, he was marked for death, first by the paranoid old guard of Nicodemo Scarfo, then by the traditionalist forces of John Stanfa, and finally, most relentlessly, by the immense, inexorable weight of the United States federal government, an adversary with limitless resources and a bottomless appetite for his destruction. His entire existence became a masterclass in navigating existential threats, a 60-year lesson in the art of not being gone. He survived assassination attempts through cunning and luck. He survived years as a fugitive through the loyalty of a small, tight circle and his own preternatural instincts for danger. He survived a devastating racketeering conviction by beating the most serious charges and enduring his prison sentence with a stoic determination that only bolstered his legend. And he survived a second, modern federal prosecution by outmaneuvering the government in a complex legal battle and securing a plea deal that left him, against all odds, a free man. But his survival was not merely physical. It was also the survival of a narrative, a story he fought to control from the bloody streets of South Philadelphia to the digital feeds of the global internet. He understood that to be forgotten was a form of death, and so he meticulously crafted his own myth, transforming himself from a public enemy into a public figure, from a mob boss into a brand, from a criminal into a curious kind of cultural icon. This final, successful rebranding was his ultimate act of survival, a strategic retreat from the front lines of crime into the safe, curated territory of celebrity, where his past became an asset rather than a liability. The flashy young gangster became the charming elder statesman, a living monument to a bygone era, his story sanitized and repackaged for mass consumption. The violence, the fear, the suffering he caused, all of it was softened by the warm, forgiving glow of nostalgia and the relentless, positive framing of his social media presence. He survived by making himself a symbol, and symbols are notoriously hard to kill. As he now moves through the autumn of his years, his survival is all but complete. He has outlived his rivals, he has outlasted the prosecutors who dedicated their careers to putting him away for life, and he has outlived the very model of organized crime that created him. The world has moved on, but he remains, a fixed point, a reference to a different time. His story is a testament to the sheer, unyielding power of the human will, a demonstration that a single-minded focus on enduring can, in itself, become a form of victory, even if that victory is ambiguous and fraught with moral compromises. Joey Merlino's life poses a difficult, unsettling question. What does it mean to win? He never achieved a permanent criminal empire, he never defeated the government, he never escaped the taint of his past. Yet, he is still here. He walks his old neighborhood, a free man, a legend, his name forever etched into the history of his city and the annals of American crime. In the end, his legacy is not one of untrammeled power or glorious triumph, but of simple, stubborn, monumental persistence. He is the man who would not be erased, the story that would not end, a reminder that in the relentless flow of time, the most formidable force is not the one that strikes the hardest blow, but the one that simply refuses to fall. If you found this deep dive into the complex and gritty reality of organized crime compelling, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more meticulously researched content. We dedicate countless hours to piecing together these narratives from a multitude of sources to bring you the most comprehensive picture possible. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What aspect of Joey Merlino's long and resilient career did you find most surprising? And don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. Thank you for watching, and for joining us on this journey into the shadows of American history. And so, the long and resonant echo of Joey Merlino's life settles not with a definitive judgment or a simple moral, but with the lingering, haunting hum of a story that is, in its entirety, a profound meditation on the very nature of survival in a world that is constantly seeking to erase you. From the moment he stepped out from his father's shadow, a skinny kid with a bottomless ambition, he was marked for death, first by the paranoid old guard of Nicodemo Scarfo, then by the traditionalist forces of John Stanfa, and finally, most relentlessly, by the immense, inexorable weight of the United States federal government, an adversary with limitless resources and a bottomless appetite for his destruction. His entire existence became a masterclass in navigating existential threats, a 60-year lesson in the art of not being gone. He survived assassination attempts through cunning and luck. He survived years as a fugitive through the loyalty of a small, tight circle and his own preternatural instincts for danger. He survived a devastating racketeering conviction by beating the most serious charges and enduring his prison sentence with a stoic determination that only bolstered his legend, and he survived a second, modern federal prosecution by outmaneuvering the government in a complex legal battle and securing a plea deal that left him, against all odds, a free man. But his survival was not merely physical, it was also the survival of a narrative, a story he fought to control from the bloody streets of South Philadelphia to the digital feeds of the global internet. He understood that to be forgotten was a form of death, and so he meticulously crafted his own myth, transforming himself from a public enemy into a public figure, from a mob boss into a brand, from a criminal into a curious kind of cultural icon. This final, successful rebranding was his ultimate act of survival, a strategic retreat from the front lines of crime into the safe, curated territory of celebrity, where his past became an asset rather than a liability. The flashy young gangster became the charming elder statesman, a living monument to a bygone era, his story sanitized and repackaged for mass consumption. The violence, the fear, the suffering he caused, all of it was softened by the warm, forgiving glow of nostalgia and the relentless, positive framing of his social media presence. He survived by making himself a symbol, and symbols are notoriously hard to kill. As he now moves through the autumn of his years, his survival is all but complete. He has outlived his rivals, he has outlasted the prosecutors who dedicated their careers to putting him away for life, and he has outlived the very model of organized crime that created him. The world has moved on, but he remains, a fixed point, a reference to a different time. His story is a testament to the sheer, unyielding power of the human will, a demonstration that a single-minded focus on enduring can, in itself, become a form of victory, even if that victory is ambiguous and fraught with moral compromises. Joey Merlino's life poses a difficult, unsettling question. What does it mean to win? He never achieved a permanent criminal empire, he never defeated the government, he never escaped the taint of his past. Yet, he is still here. He walks his old neighborhood, a free man, a legend, his name forever etched into the history of his city and the annals of American crime. In the end, his legacy is not one of untrammeled power or glorious triumph, but of simple, stubborn, monumental persistence. He is the man who would not be erased, the story that would not end, a reminder that in the relentless flow of time, the most formidable force is not the one that strikes the hardest blow, but the one that simply refuses to fall. If you found this deep dive into the complex and gritty reality of organized crime compelling, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more meticulously researched content. We dedicate countless hours to piecing together these narratives from a multitude of sources to bring you the most comprehensive picture possible. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What aspect of Joey Merlino's long and resilient career did you find most surprising? And don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. Thank you for watching, and for joining us on this journey into the shadows of American history.